Zoom meeting, so I'll let you all get started while I set up this live Facebook recording.
Okay. Well, welcome to all of you who are attending. This is an open meeting of the Cohasset Harbor Committee and the Cohasset Harbor Infrastructure Planning Working Group. Welcome to the first meeting, public meeting of the Cohasset Harbor Resilience Initiative. The Cohasset Harbor Committee has asked George Baumgarten and Lisa Hewitt to lead what we hope to be a multi-year effort to identify the vulnerabilities in Cohasset Harbor and the wider community, to develop plans and address them and find the funding to implement these plans. We are most fortunate to have our panel this evening, 3 experts in the fields of environmental and climate-related science. I thank them for their willingness to work with us on this critical issue. There is much to be done, and having the support of the community is very important if we are to be successful. Thank you for your participation this evening, and please let us know if you would like to help us as we move forward. With that, I'd like to turn this over to George. George, if you can let us know where we're going. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And good evening and welcome. I'm George Baumgarten, member of the Cohasset Harbor Committee, and along with Lisa Hewitt-Dick, who is the co-lead for this initiative, we welcome you to tonight's forum about exploring potential impacts of extreme weather on Cohasset Harbor. Tonight is the first forum for this initiative. In addition to tonight, we are planning 2 additional forums in the next 6 to 12 weeks. The second is going to be around municipal vulnerability planning related to Cohasset Harbor. And the third will feature our state legislators speaking about funding, a view from Beacon Hill. Our primary objective for this series of forums is to explore climate resilience related to Cohasset Harbor. And I wanted to take just a moment to really focus in on what do we mean by climate resilience. So if you look on the screen, it's I want everyone to think about the ability for Cohasset, even your street, your home, to rebound from a shock such as a natural disaster. So building resilience requires not only recognizing potential hazards like extreme weather events, but also understanding the underlying vulnerabilities that may affect recovery from them. So as Tim mentioned, we are delighted to be joined by 4 expert speakers tonight. They are our very own Lauren Lind. Lauren is the planning director for the town of Cohasset. She'll be followed by Mark Borelli. Mark is a PhD in geology and is with the Center for Coastal Studies. Mark led the Stormtime Pathways study in 2019 and 2020 for Cohasset and Scituate under a grant from the state of Massachusetts. Tom Bell will be our third speaker. Tom's also a PhD in geology. His education and career is focused on hydrogeology and GIS. And Tom is also a member of the Cohasset Conservation Commission. And our final speaker is Jack Buckley. Jack is a conservationist and a longtime leader of the Cohasset Center for Student Coastal Research. So the format for tonight is approximately 45 to 50 minutes of presentation, followed by Q&A. Our ask of you is that you jot down your questions as they occur to you during the presentation, either as notes to yourself or in the Zoom chat. Following the 4 presentations, we will invite you to ask your questions during the Q&A sessions. So thank you again for joining us tonight. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lauren Lind. Lauren?
Thank you so much, George, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to quickly share my screen and walk you through a brief presentation to give you some background about some planning initiatives that we've taken in town in the past few years related to climate resilience. So first, I'll begin by talking about the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Plan, or as you'll hear us refer to it, the MVP program. This is a state program run through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that helps communities define extreme weather and natural climate related hazards, as well as identify what existing strengths and challenges there are in the community, as well as vulnerabilities and assets. This planning process helps communities to develop and prioritize opportunities that the town can take, or in city could take, to reduce risk and build resilience. So the town of Cohasset undertook this program in 2017 leading into 2018 with help from our regional planning agency known as Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Here you'll see many of you actually may recognize yourself in this photo. This is a photo that was from one of two of the day workshops that they had for the MVP program. And then this is where the facilitators from our regional planning agency worked with stakeholders and interested parties in the communities to help identify these topics and how we could plan for resiliency in our community. Of a series of priorities that were identified, there were 11 that rose to the top based on the participants that were at those forums. And those relate to the topics that you see on the screen here. And I won't go into too much detail here because we've got a lot of great speakers lined up after me, and the MVP program and report are all historical information that you can access on the town website and by contacting myself, Planning Director Lauren Lind. But I will note for our purposes, two of the priority items that were identified through this program, coastal flooding protection and sea level rise planning, which we're going to get into much more detail tonight. Speaking of the MVP program, by becoming an MVP community, the town was able to become eligible for state funding and grant opportunities known as the MVP Action Grant, which the town partnered with the town of Scituate actually in 2020 to do a Stormtime Pathway mapping study for both communities through the Center for Coastal Studies, who you'll be hearing from right after I finish speaking. But before I get there, I just want to give you a little bit more background about sort of the planning initiatives that we've taken in the past few years after the MVP program. A couple of noteworthy long-range planning documents here. We have the 2019 Cohasset Master Plan, the 2020 State-Approved Municipal Harbor Plan, the update to the Open Space and Recreation Plan, as well as a 2020 Hazard Mitigation Plan update. All of these documents went through their own public processes involving stakeholders and getting feedback to try to create strategies and goals, both medium, short, and long-term, so that we can, as a community as a whole, begin to look at this more holistically and plan for the future. What I'll also note is that you'll see here 2020 Climate Resilience Initiative. There's been sort of a groundswelling of interest in climate resiliency as we've seen in the past couple of months. And while we know that it's been identified in these plans, we're really hearing more from the community as we continue to see impacts from climate change impact our community on a day-to-day basis. So what we are looking to do as a town is to try to address and study some of our aspects related to energy, climate, waste reduction, water conservation, and land conservation, to take sort of a baseline as to what we've done so far, what our goals have been established, and then put out a Cohasset Climate Mitigation Status Report, which we are hoping to release within the next couple of weeks to a month with help from one of our part-time staff members, Brianna Bennett, who's our Energy and Environmental Assistant. So I've been working with Brianna as well as the Harbor Committee to put together this document, and we're really looking forward to releasing that. And ultimately what we hope to do is begin to further involve our stakeholders and interested parties in town so that we can convene around Earth Day in the spring for a summit to address a series of these topics and then identify where we want to go from here. So without further ado, I'm going to stop my screen sharing. Thank you all so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mark Borelli from the Center for Coastal Studies to give you a bit more detail about the project that we went through with the MVP Action Grant for Stormtime Pathways mapping. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to stop my video just to sort of reduce the amount of bandwidth while I'm giving the talk. I'll share that, and then I will start the presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. Okay, all right, so basically, Lauren mentioned we had done a study for Cohasset and Scituate 2019 and 2020, and we finished it up, and we just want to, I want to basically, well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me, and I want to, not all towns are doing this. You guys are ahead of the curve, good for you. There's a lot going on, and to have 50 or 60 people here on a weeknight having this discussion is phenomenal, so good for you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to show you how we map Stormtime Pathways, and then I'm going to show you the results from Cohasset. So basically, when we first started this in 2015, 2016, We started in Provincetown. I'm the director of the seafloor mapping program there in Provincetown. So we have this really wonderful data visualization software. So we can take data like LiDAR, right? This is LiDAR data, and it's three-dimensional data, and it's really, really high resolution, and we just use the best available data that we have. And we take these data into our data visualization software, and we can do all kinds of analysis, right? So this is downtown Provincetown, and when we started doing this, this is what you could see in downtown Provincetown in surging seas. Now, this is a website that does this state by state, so they do a huge amount of work. But as you can see here, this is as far as you can zoom in, right? You can't zoom in any further, it's all grayed out. So we thought to ourselves, if we're gonna give these data to town and do this kind of work, we wanna give them higher resolution data so they can zoom right into really anywhere they want in town. So we're all using the same data, right? We're all using this wonderful elevation data, this LiDAR data that NOAA and other agencies collect for us. So again, we're in downtown Provincetown. Now we zoom in here. What we can do with our software is we can drape an aerial photograph over that LiDAR data. And now the photograph becomes a three-dimensional surface, okay? So we zoom in using our software and we start to raise the water up. This is downtown Provincetown. And right here, before there's any hydrologic connection, we can draw a profile in the software, and it's just like sort of slicing a cake, right? So you can see as the water raises up in Provincetown Harbor, you have what we call Stormtime Pathway. If you can stop water from flowing in this area, you stop this area from getting flooded. And that's what we're really going for. There's another Stormtime Pathway, and if you can stop water flowing here, you can stop this entire area from getting flooded. Now, for better or for worse, we did the study in 2016. It came out in 2016, and in January of 2018, we all know what happened, right? We had our new storm of record. And I'm going to ask you to keep your eye on the flower pot here. This is downtown Provincetown, right where that Stormtime Pathway was, about an hour before high tide on January 4th, 2018, and this is all salt water. There was a huge amount of damage done to the town that day. I'm going to show you this video here. It's a little grainier. You can see the flower pot's making its way across the intersection, but I'm including it because of what he does here. He's going to pan to the harbor, right? He stops here, and if you notice, these are all underwater. This is a huge amount of water for downtown Provincetown. It was about a half a foot high, just a little under half a foot higher than the blizzard of 78. So Provincetown really got beat up, as did a lot of Massachusetts. When we create these Stormtime Pathways, we have GIS data. This is the stuff that Tom works with. And just another pat on the back to Cohasset. To have somebody like Tom Bell helping out the town is really extraordinary. You've got a ringer, so use them as much as you can. But so we have this GIS data, and you can mouse over it and it shows you what the elevations are, and it shows you where all the water is going to flow. So as soon as that water reaches a certain elevation, there's going to be water flow over the land. We created a stormtides.org website. Now, it doesn't have the Situate Cohasset data on there because we hadn't put it together when we were doing your project. We could do that, and we maybe we will in the future, but you can go online and link to see what these data are, link to the National Weather Service predictions in real time. And we have our data, and you can change the elevation and the heights and zoom in and zoom out and go all over. But now I want to jump into the Situate, rather the Cohasset data here. Again, when Lauren said, when we did the MVP program grant, they do like to have multi-towns, regional efforts. So we put Cohasset and Situate together. You guys, unfortunately, you got a lot of low-lying areas and you get a lot of water flowing. Saturday could be interesting for all of us, really. So what we did was we started with doing the analysis using the LiDAR, and we found 443 potential Stormtime Pathways throughout both towns. We did our field work from November to March, and we would go out and use GPS, and we would GPS each one of these sites, right, with an RTK GPS, a really high resolution GPS. Oh, sorry, jumped ahead there. And this is the GPS. So we would actually shoot each one of these throughout the town. And the accuracy of this instrument is in the vertical, it's about an inch. So it's really the gold standard for positional data. And we just went out through both towns and got all these. So started with 453. We ended up with 465. We have 330 verified and 135 unverified. Unverified means we couldn't actually get there, which almost always means it was private property. So while we don't remove those storm type pathways. We just say they're unverified. So there's something that you should look at, right? You should be aware of it. And if you can get permission to go on the private property, you can, but we don't have, we don't have the kind of time to sort of find each one of these on private property, get permits and things like that. So, but we had that final data set. And again, by town, there's 300, almost 300 in Situate, and you guys had 166 in Cohasset. And we start at the highest high tide of the year, right? That's when we start doing our mapping. And then we go all the way up to the storm of record. And then we added like 3 or 4 feet. So it's good, it's useful for planning for storms. Towns like Provincetown and Truro, where we've done this mapping, they literally use it when there are storms coming. So like for Saturday, I can guarantee you there are people in Provincetown, Truro, and a lot of all the other towns in Cape Cod Bay we've done and on Nantucket. They're going to be looking at these data and seeing what the predictions are. And then they're going to look at, which storm type pathways are within that range. So if it is a 10 or 11 or a 12, they can call these up and look at those places, look at those locations and see how much water was going to be there at that time. So again, we break it down. Once you have these data, and Tom is looking at these data, you can look at them in a lot of different ways. So you look at them by elevation and where all the storm type pathways are and find out, again, for a coming storm, where your storm type pathways are going to be. And again, each one of these storm type pathways has a latitude, a longitude, and an elevation. So you know exactly where it is. You can look at data like this, right? So we put all the storm type pathways by elevation, and you can look at the storm of record. So this is the January storm of record. This is I think, for me, this is pretty interesting. If you look at just a foot above the storm of record, right? So these are storm type pathways that have never flooded in recorded history, right? No one's been around when this much water has been in Cohasset. But if you just look at these, and now this is for both towns, but I'm just going to pull the ones out in Cohasset. So you guys have 21 storm type pathways that are less than a foot above the storm of record, and they've never been flooded, right? So these are places that no one knows to do anything. I mean, if you have the storm type pathways that are just below the storm of record, people have been around, they know when the storm's coming, let's keep an eye on these. You can, there's sandbags, those portable flood walls, you can block off roads. You have 21 storm type pathways that have never been flooded. So these are the kinds of things that the data sets that we have, the maps that you all have, the GIS data can be really useful for planning purposes. And Tom's going to get into more specifics. So again, this more of this same kind of thing. These are the storm type pathways in Cohasset that are above, just above the storm of record. Another interesting fact, which kind of scary when you think about it, and I didn't break this out by town, and I probably should have, so I apologize. But for every, again, we go above that storm of record, for every 6 inches of total water level increase, there's 100 acres of inundation. 100 acres more inundation for every 6 inches. And this is throughout Situate and Cohasset. And we can narrow that down for Cohasset, but if you think about that, so you have the storm of record. If you add 6 inches on average throughout this data set, you're gonna have another 100 acres of inundation. So if it's a foot, it's 200 acres. If it's a foot and a half, it's 300. Now that's an average, but it's a pretty good average. It's a pretty good mean with not a high standard deviation. So it's something to think about when we talk about 6 inches of sea level rise. When we talk about a storm surge that's a little bit higher than the last time, it can make a big difference. That's last thing I'll do before we get into Tom's more specific stuff is we'll talk about, this is something that just happened. This is October 27th, this year, or last year, sorry, 2021. And this is, you go to the NOAA website and you can see these data. So this is, the blue is the predicted, the green is observed or verified. And then the difference is the storm surge, right? So on October 27th, we had a 3.5 foot, 3.61 storm surge on that storm, but it was a neap tide. So it wasn't that bad. A week later, or about 10 days later, we had king tide. On November 6th, we had these big king tides. Now, if this storm surge peaked with this king tide, you would have had 15.15. That's our storm of record in Boston. This is the Boston tide gauge because it's got a longer record. So you would have had that 3.6 plus that 12.09. It would have been a half a foot higher than the storm of record. So you just had a storm surge in October and a king tide in November that missed by about 10 days. And had they happened together, you would have had the biggest storm you've ever seen here by half a foot. So these things aren't that rare, right? They're not that unusual. and it's like a spinning wheel, and every once in a while everything lines up and it hits where it needs to hit. You have these big storms. So yes, they're a storm of record, and we call it, and that's the last thing I'll say is, we have this thing we say, 100-year storm. Well, we had a 100-year storm in the blizzard of 78 was a 100-year storm, but we just had another 100-year storm in 2018, 40 years later. So we have to be careful with that terminology, right? It's a return frequency event. The odds of it happening in any given year are 1%. So over 100 years, it's going to happen. But you could have a 100-year storm every year, right? It's just unlikely. But we have had 2 100-year storms in the last 40 years. So these things are changing, and the fact that Cohasset is on this now and thinking about it, thinking ahead, is really great. I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to go over and I'm going to give it over to Tom. And again, we're going to get the questions later. So looking forward to it.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. Great. Thanks, Mark. That was really great. I hope you can all see that.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. My numbers are going to be a little bit different because they're referenced to a different datum, but they're essentially equivalent. So where Mark left off, I'm going to pick up and show some specifics about what would happen in Cohasset. And let me be able to advance this. Here we go. So our recent storm of October 27th was pretty dramatic. We all were in awe in the number of large trees that went down, and I think we really focused on that. It was not, there was no flood, so it sort of maybe slipped through the cracks of thinking about it. But as Mark pointed out, there was a storm surge of 3 to just over 3.5 feet, but it was over 3 feet for 12 hours. That's 2 tide cycles. That's pretty critical. So we saw the trees go down. We saw some boats wash up. And as Mark points out, if this had happened on November 6th, when we had a king tide, it would have been a completely different story. We would have been overtopping the roads in the harbor, and we would have had a situation like this. Let me explain how to read this map very briefly. There are some contours here. There's a 1-foot contour, a 3-foot contour, 5, 10, and above. It's also color-coded here so that you can immediately sort of grasp that these magenta areas, the dark blue area is obviously the deepest, but on land, the dark magenta is generally over 5 feet. And so anything between the green and the blue line, and it's in magenta, you're looking at 5 to 10 feet of inundation. The central part of Cohasset is the most vulnerable part of town. Flooding would have taken place, of course, in Little Harbor and at Straits Pond, but I'm going to focus here because this is the most, as I say, the most vulnerable part of town. We have the most infrastructure here. We arguably have more valuable real estate, and at least in the sense of numbers. So what I'm going to walk you through is what would happen on that October 27th if it happened on November 6th. And let me point out a couple of things. Mark had identified lots of spots in town that are sort of like a staircase. If you breach one, and then you breach the second one, and you breach the third one, you get different degrees of flooding. And with this, it's a little bit harder to know exactly where those are from the way I've done it, but the effect is the same. So I want to point out some of our obvious vulnerabilities. Border and margin act like a dam. This is all below the high tide level, by the way. All this a lot of parts of town are below the high tide level. We have a dike here in our road system, but at 11 feet of storm tide, that would be breached here, 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 and here. And then this is the Gulf River here. You end up with a very wide and in fact fairly deep area where there can be a great deal of flow. This is a serious issue right here. This is also a serious issue. So look, the salt water may or may not penetrate all the way to the music circus, but the elevation is such that given enough time, it could. So I want you to really focus on what's happening here, 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 and here for the next slide. Oh, what happened there? Don't tell me. Hang on. Got it. So we're going to zoom in here a little bit on this so you can see that the wastewater treatment plant is here. Our public safety building is here. We have a significant municipal water well here. And all of these obviously are threatened by a flood of salt water. This is a little close up. You can see that we're talking about, remember, black to white is 1 to 3 feet. So the channel here or the area of flow here at Veterans Memorial Park would be somewhere between 1 and 3 feet deep. Back over here, you're looking at 5 feet. That's not good at all. I also want you to look at the roadways here. This is Elm Street, which would, and this is Margin. These would become impassable under these circumstances. Here's your public safety building. Getting our EMTs, our fire trucks, our police cars out to the east, the northeast part of town would be very difficult. Getting it to the south part of town would also be difficult. You can see that there's a barrier here. You can get around it here, but when you come down South Main, you've got 5 feet of water almost in some of these places. So these are obviously, these are vulnerabilities. Again, here, and here are, and just off the screen at Parker Street are your main area of flow. Just quickly, I want to mention that those aren't the only areas. We adjoin Situate, and there could be a situation in Situate where Egypt Beach is breached through waves or something, and the flood could come literally down the valley from the Scotchwood Pond, and we'd have an even bigger problem. So let me be careful about what button I'm pushing this time. So as bad as nor'easters are, hurricanes are far more dangerous. Fortunately, they're far less frequent. Hurricane Sandy, a Category 3 hurricane, devastated mid-Atlantic and the New England coast. And the question is, what would happen if it hit Cohasset instead of New York? Well, this is the tide station in Manhattan. And you can see that the storm surge was bigger than the predicted tide. So we would have been talking about something in the order of 16 feet here. It's 5 feet higher than what we were just looking at. So anything, if you saw your house there and you thought, oh man, it's under 5 feet of water. In this scenario, your house is 10 feet underwater. So I started to do a Category 3 storm and thought, I can't even recognize the coast when I flood it. And it would be very hard for all of us to kind of, where are you? This looks like a different town, and it would be. Massachusetts has been impacted by 10 Category 1 hurricanes since in the last 178 years. And so I took a Category 1 storm, took the highest surge that is within that category as 5 feet, added a king tide, and took it to 13 feet and asked the question, well, what would this look like? And bear in mind that hurricanes also pack a heck of a lot more water because they're coming off a warm Atlantic instead of a cold Atlantic. So you not only get a 100-year storm in terms of coastal storm surge, you probably get a 100-year storm in terms of rainfall as well. So here's what it looks. The first thing I'd call your attention to is the footprint of the flood really hasn't changed much. It's pushed a little past the, on the west, it's pushed a little past the music circus up here. It might potentially affect another couple of wells. I don't know whether we use these or not, but there's a couple of wells here at Sawyer Street. What's really happened here is you'll see that from Sandy Beach, all of a sudden you've got water flowing down Atlantic Avenue here, or connecting. It's not necessarily flowing. This is still water. This is still water flooding. And once these two meet, of course, there's not a lot of flow between them. This zone of storm tide flooding is now gone to 5 feet, and it's gotten a little bit wider. So you're going to get greater flow here. The danger here, of course, is there's a drop off on the landward side of this road. So when that salt water starts plunging off that drop off, it's going to start peeling its way back towards Cohasset Harbor, digging a channel. And if that actually cuts through all the way, we're not talking about 5 feet anymore. You're talking about more like 10 feet. So this is a serious vulnerability here. Notice that this one's gone 5+ feet everywhere. There's serious potential for flow here. Houses that might have only seen 3 feet of water might be seeing 5 now. So a hurricane poses significantly greater risks. And Jack will talk more about this than I will, but you also have to remember that there's water arriving from the west in our assumed 8 inches of rain. Let's assume it's a 100-year storm, and 100-year storm here means 8 inches of rain. So you're getting it from both ends here, both sides. So let's kind of tally this up in a this is really crude, but it gives you some notion of what sort of damage we're talking about and what's really at risk. I've alluded to the commercial buildings and the residences and the treatment plant and the well, and the post office would be flooded, churches. The sewer lines, their manholes would pop off perhaps, and then they would become flooded. That's a serious issue for the sewer department. Damaged roads, yes, not just Border Street or Margin Street, but any place where the velocity is high and there's a steep gradient on one side of the road or the other, there's potential for erosion. And when you erode these roads, and they work as some of these barriers that Mark was alluding to for triggering secondary flooding, these can be the cause of it. We have some damage amplifiers, flood from the storm runoff, of course, down trees, power lines, blocked evacuation routes. Another thing that comes up is we have, when the storm's over, we're still flooded. And how do you get all that water back into the harbor? And we're talking about a lot of water here. We would have to, for the most part, pump. We can't just open the little culvert that goes between James Brook and the harbor. I mean, it's like, it's just not sufficient to drain the area that's flooded very quickly. So we would literally have to be pumping water over the top of Border Street and perhaps in that gap where Black Horse Lane is. Well, I did a very conservative estimate of what the total damage would be. And believe me, this is very conservative. I didn't consider damage to anybody's vehicles, to their backyards, their front yards, sidewalks, nothing, their vegetation. This is only considering what would happen to a building, a business or a residence. And I've dropped it into these categories that correspond to my contour lines, and anything under 1 foot, it's what would be considered nuisance flooding. But if you've got a basement that's going to be capturing water, you're going to lose and your mechanicals are in your basement, you're going to lose your heating system and perhaps your electrical system. So I conservatively estimated what it would cost to replace it in 52 homes. Basement flooding, first floor flooding, obviously more expensive. Catastrophic flooding, about half, I figured about half the value, the assessed value of the house, not its real world value, but its assessed value. Notice the difference between 11 feet and 13 feet. All of a sudden, the damage here to our building is doubles. And even if I don't have the numbers right, I do have the proportions right, I think. The 72 here end up getting bumped into these categories. And so there's a progression here. You may only see, you have 52 here and it stays at 52, 53, but that's because the footprint didn't change much. But as the depth increases, some of these guys move into a higher category of damage. Just about done here. I want to put this in the context of the James Brook watershed, which I've outlined in black. Of course, a watershed means that every drop of rain that falls within that black boundary ends up in groundwater or as stormwater runoff. This is the channel network. This is these are floodplains, these lighter areas prone to flooding. And this is the footprint of our 13-foot storm. And remember, the footprint here isn't much different from the 11-foot storm. So you've got water coming in this direction and from the sides, and you've got salt water coming in this direction. They're going to meet someplace. And many of these pale blue areas aren't going to be flooded by salt water. They're going to get it by fresh water. Jack's going to take over from here. I just wanted to amplify one more time. We got a nor'easter coming. Here's what NOAA had to say this afternoon. This is the predicted tide for Whitehead. Just one more aside. Tides are referenced to mean low water. That means they're about 5.3 feet below all the reference datum that I've been using here. So if you subtract 5.3 feet from this, and then you add whatever surge you've got, that's what we will see on Saturday. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
All righty. I think I'm up here, so I'm going to share my screen. And can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. So thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mark. I think I'll probably touch on some of the things that you guys were saying, but I think that this will be a good way to complement the data and the visuals, because I have a lot more pictures to show. So I think it'll bring a little bit of life into the data discussion. So I'm going to talk, as Tom said, about the Watershed Connection. And this is a story map that I'll be able to share with you, but I'm going to start. Let me just move my Zoom screen out of the way there. On this map right here, I have some of the same data that Tom and Mark were talking about. There's the Stormtime Pathways that are verified, unverified, and pictures that my colleague Susan Bryant and I, along with student Jacob Van Riel, started shooting in November at the King Tide, and then again on January 2nd. So I'll just go to this screen here. I want to show you 4 pictures that illustrate some of the points that were being made in the previous discussions. So this first picture right here, actually I'm going to close that and just show you that there are storm-tide pathways, as I said, that are adjacent to all of the images that I'm going to show. So back to the first image. This is taken from the Fisherman's Dock, looking down Bailey's Creek and at the Sailing Club. And you can see just how high the water's edge there is. And if we zoom into the Sailing Club, you can see that the frontage of the Sailing Club, the approach down to their gangway and dock, is completely inundated, and it's literally a couple of inches in height before it's into the Sailing Club. And in the distance, you can see Parker Ave, you can see the Mariners Park landing, and the water is right up to the edge at that point. So then we'll cruise back over to Town Landing at the Captain James Smith Memorial Town Landing. Take a look at a photo there, and you can see complete inundation again, as it has been referenced many times in Tom's map and Mark's talk about the Stormtide Pathways. And you begin to get a feel for the reality of the previous 2 presentations. So if we continue around the harbor, we'll go over to Margin Street. Tom spent some time talking about what that looks like. So we'll look at Margin Street and Stockbridge Stormtide Pathway. And again, the point's been made several times that these are flood tides without any precipitation, mild storm surge with this particular one, but no weather event in particular. And so when you look at the structural vulnerability, it's pretty darn clear that the capacity of the harbor to hold the water within the bounds and confines of the harbors is severely compromised. And Tom was talking about the inability of safety vehicles to make its way through. You can obviously see what that looks like. So we'll go one more picture. We'll go over to the yacht club again, Stormtime Pathways all around here. And we'll look at what Howard Gleason Road looks like in the yacht club. And again, you can see at the harbor's edge, complete inundation. And it doesn't take much of an imagination to realize that Bassing's Beach is almost breached as well. So as Tom had said, I'd talk a little bit more about the looking upstream and talking about the James Brook watershed. So we have that same layer here showing that reach. And I'm going to, as I said, just walk you through some considerations about thinking about harbor vulnerability and its connection to the watershed. And Tom had mentioned what a watershed is. So we have a little diagram illustrating the concept of the edges defining the water flow into tributaries and streams, and they're making their way to the harbor. One of the things that I wanted to point out about the James Brook watershed is that it's only 15% of the actual territorial community, but it has 33% of the residential parcels are in the watershed. So here's another view of the homes in the James Brook watershed. And as it's been pointed out, the tidals, the storm surge is pushing in from the ocean, but we have the high point of Wheelwright Park and Forest Ave forming the northern edge, Situate Hill forming the southern high point, Avalon and the commercial development there at the medical center, Deer Hill, Bear Hill, Cohasset High School on the southern edge, and it's all feeding water into Sanctuary Pond, down James Brook, underneath the town of Cohasset. Part of it comes back out and another part of it meanders around into the well field and then back through Jacobs Meadow into the cove. And so for those of you who don't know exactly what this little particular body looks like, I put together a few pictures. So here we are at the headwaters of Sanctuary Pond, right behind Rosano Davis, Rocky Lane, the Rose Hill cul-de-sac. And so here's the headwaters. And then looking downstream, it's a beautiful, picturesque little stream, but we need to imagine what this might look like when we're talking about some of the precipitation that might come with a hurricane or with a northeaster as well. And so this is a picture of where the stream approaches the village right at Smith Place, right near Fresh Feast and the Social Arts Center, if you can picture that. So if you know where Smith Place is, and there's the little James Brook shops nearby. Anyways, it goes underneath the town and it resurfaces at the wastewater treatment plant. And you can't quite see the brook here. You can make out a little bit, but it runs alongside the wastewater treatment plant. Tom had talked about the vulnerability. It passes the wastewater treatment plant, meanders through the beautiful Jacobs Meadow, and it comes out near the Legion at the head of the cove. And I purposely chose this picture because we have water coming downstream in the James Brook watershed. And you can see there's no water. There's no place for the water to go. So if we get that triple whammy of a king tide, high tidal, high storm surge with precipitation, there's that collision that Tom had talked about where water trying to get out of the harbor and the water coming into the harbor, there's very little room for it to go. So a little bit about the new normals. NOAA is predicting that there's going to be a wetter New England, and that's the trend that they are forecasting in their new normals. And we might ask the question, is Cohasset going to be wetter? So I looked at the data that's available from the DEP website, the Cohasset Water Department. And if we graph the last 85 years from 36 to 1936 to 2021, it looks fairly steady to me anyways. It's at its peaks and its dry years and wet years. But if you look a little bit deeper at that data, there have been 11 years in which these high points are 60 inches. So taking 60 inches as the threshold, 6 of those 11 years in which we've had rainfall exceeding 60 inches have occurred in the past 25 years. And whether or not this portends to be a trend in increased precipitation for the town of Cohasset, we certainly would be better off. It's the same data in the column graph. We'd be much better off in our harbor resilience planning to plan for a wetter Cohasset as well. And this is a picture of flooding in March of 2018, just at Summer Street. Just on the edge of Summer Street, looking down Black Horse Lane with flooding here. And I want to pause here and just put together a map in which, if you look at the darker colors that jump out along with James Brook. Oh, and the red line, the one thing I want to point about the watershed, it cuts right through the heart of Cohasset, and that's the Greenbush line. So coming right down, the center of the town is the Greenbush line. But anyways, back to the James Brook watershed and James Brook itself. All of the darker colors are the impervious surfaces. And if we continue to increase impervious surface coverage in the watershed, it's only going to exacerbate stormwater management issues. And although this is Jerusalem Road Causeway, it's still a good visual reminder about what we are going to be looking at. And Mark and Tom obviously did great job in providing the data, but here's a visual that accompanies that data and gives us a good look at what a not so severe storm might look like. So in conclusion, I'll share this story map. You can take a look at. My 10-minute timer is telling me I am done. And there's a little video here. This is Margin Street. I shot a 30-second video that shows on a dry day, low tide. Here's a salt marsh, and there's water coming into the harbor to illustrate the concept or to drive home the point that harbor resiliency is connected to the watershed, and watershed planning and stormwater management are equally important. Lauren actually alluded to that in the plans that she spoke about in the beginning. And I'll wrap up my part here and simply say that the Cohasset Municipal Harbor Plan reminds us that the harbor area does not exist in isolation. And we have spoken much in town about the Elm Street Corridor and Elm Street providing the connection. And so I would invite everybody to think about the James Brook Corridor as being equally important in the conversation about community resilience with respect to harbor resilience and preparing for the worst case scenario. So as I said, I will copy this and I will stick it in the chat, and people can look at the story map that I made, and it has some more info from the Municipal Harbor Plan and a couple of maps to play around with. So you can take a look at the pictures yourself as well. And I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to George.
Thanks, Jack.
Jack, thank you so much. And Mark and Tom, those are terrific presentations. And a great job on keeping time for us to have some Q&A. So now is the time. Maybe actually I'd like to turn it to Lauren, and maybe you can just go through the guidelines on how we're going to conduct Q&A. Lauren?
Absolutely, thank you. So we're going to use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen to manage the Q&A. What we'll ask is you can either leave written comments in there, you can just put your name and address in and indicate that you'd like to speak, or you can raise your hand if you'd like to use the raise hand function. And I'll just take them in the order that I see them coming in. And then if you could, just state your name and address for the record when you're speaking. This is a recorded meeting and it is actually an open Harbor Committee meeting, Harbor and Chip Working Group. So we just like to have a good public record of who has been interacting with us. So thank you. And I'm going to get started going through our Q&A. First, we have Corey Evans with a comment that just says, we have a young resident who is passionate about weather and does his own weather forecasting on his Twitter. The account is @Callan, CALLAN weather. Thank you for sharing that information. And Callan, if you're listening, I recommend that you reach out to Jack Buckley because I'm sure he's got some great ideas to loop you into his work over at the Center for Students Coastal Studies. So thank you. Next, we have a comment from Jeff Dons. Great work on conducting the analysis of the vulnerabilities using progressive tools such as LiDAR and GIS. That's the first step of understanding the problem. Where are we starting the process of developing steps to mitigation? Perhaps you're familiar with the Climate Resilience Toolkit from NOAA that helps outline the steps to resiliency. Might be useful in planning phases and developing mitigation steps, and gives a link. He says he does a lot of work with NOAA folks behind this and would be happy to help connect some dots. Jeff, he also states later on, it may also become familiar with the work of First Street Foundation. They're developing flood inundation to the parcel level. So Jeff, I just want to say thank you. You may or may not have heard in the beginning that we're, as a community in a town, looking to do a deeper dive about our climate resilience in a more broad spectrum. So I'd be happy to follow up on these two recommendations for that. One more comment in the Q&A, and then I'm going to get over to the raised hands and start promoting some folks to chat. This comment is from the Dick family. Most homeowners know our home's land elevation above mean sea level. Could Tom translate his 11-foot and 13-foot storm surge references into elevation above MSL? I'll turn that to Tom if he has any thoughts on that question.
Yeah. Ooh, that didn't sound good. Yeah, let me explain that if I can easily. All elevations are related to a so-called datum. We in some cases it's an arbitrary datum like local mean low water, and but in general in the United States we have national datum, which is now national North American vertical datum of 1988. And this is a model of the Earth that we relate all elevations to. So when I was speaking, all of the, I'd converted all of my tidal and storms and all of my elevations basically to that North American vertical datum of 1988. It can get confusing because when you read the tide tables, they are related to mean lowest low water. I always mess that up, but MLLW. And so you have to make a conversion. Here in Cohasset, the conversion, mean low water is 5.39 feet below zero North American vertical datum of 1988. So when you see a 12.39 foot tide, you subtract 5.39 feet to get that elevation. And that's what the NAVD elevation is, what we use in all of our terrestrial measurements. So topography, the elevation of your house, for example, you were asking about that. That would be reference to NAVD 88. The datum issue can be quite confusing for newcomers, and I would recommend that you look at the datum page from NOAA, because they have a very good explanation of all the various data that are used and what they're used for. But your house is probably, it's going to be related to NAVD. It's not related to sea level. Although sea level is only about, I believe it's only about half a foot difference here in Cohasset, but it can be, the difference can be greater depending on where you are. Sorry for the long-winded thing, but it's a complex subject.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to head over to, I'm going to bring up John Leffel into our panelist. He has his hand raised. And while John joins us, I'll just again repeat for anyone who wishes to speak, we have the ability to bring you up to panel to use your microphone and camera. So please just either let me know via the Q&A or just raise a hand. Thank you. Hi, John.
Me? Oh,
That's
thanks.
you. Yes, thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you very much. And special thanks to you, Lauren and Tim, for putting this together. And Mark and Tom and Jack, fantastic stuff. It's fantastic. I think everyone should see all this data. I guess the question I have really is about the waste treatment facility in our town. It seems that that is particularly much in the center, particularly vulnerable. And personally, I'm asking that question because I've lived in a town where they did have a 100-year flood, and water, potable water, was a real problem for us. Is the solution we're driving to somehow secure wastewater treatment in the event of this 100-year event? Is that where we're going? I would think it would be a priority.
Thank you for that question. I'll also just echo that we received a similar question referencing wastewater treatment plant from Corey Evans of 313 North Main Street, asking, one of the maps presented by Tom Bell showed the wastewater treatment plant in the middle of what seems like a high flood area as part of our vital infrastructure. Could you expand more on flood levels in your analysis? So I want to thank everyone for bringing up this point. It's certainly a big factor to take into our resilience planning. And as we continue to explore our MVP Action Grant Program opportunities, I think this is a vital opportunity to take a look at that interaction between the two of them from a public health and wellness perspective as well. Do any of our panelists have any comments to add? Seeing none, I'm going to bring up some more. We have Nina Miscotia and Jack Creighton who would like to address the board. I'm just going to start bringing folks in. All right, Nina, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I am actually a resident in Cohasset, but I'm here on behalf of Representative Joan Machino. But I was curious about the condos that are being built right next to Cohasset Harbor, where the hotel is now. And I did research into sort of Boston, like sort of doing their open space plan and new seawall ideas. Wouldn't that sort of be more of a benefit rather than these buildings that are going to be flooded eventually?
So Nina, thank you so much for that question. The property that you're referencing, many folks will be familiar. It's the current height of the Cohasset Harbor Inn. It is also known as 124 Elm Street. That project, it's a private property development. It has gone through local and state review. Something that they have to do as a part of their proximity to the watershed is bring their project into compliance with current FEMA flood elevations. So the actual redevelopment of that parcel is ultimately going to become a more resilient parcel than what exists in current day standards. The structure that's there is several decades old, so would not have been in compliance with current day standards. So they have gone through extensive permitting with the state as well as local jurisdictions to make sure that what they're doing at least is an improvement to what would be there and that had been there.
Lauren?
Yes, Tim.
Let me just add, in addition to the new construction for Cohasset Hospitality Partners, the condominiums you referred to, there is a town working group, part of the Master Plan Implementation Committee, called the Elm Street Corridor Working Group. And one of the things we're looking at, in addition to redesigning some of the parts of the Elm Street and the intersection down by the what is now the Cohasset Harbor Inn, is looking at what we can do as we improve that area to make it more resilient to potential flooding. And there are a number of things we are looking at that would be both stormwater mitigation, stormwater flooding mitigation, as well as sea level rising and storm surge mitigation. So very good point. As our speakers have pointed out, that's really kind of a key point, not just Elm Street, but also James Brook. So we are looking carefully at that.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that additional information. I'm going to turn it to Tom Callahan in a moment, who's a member of the planning board, as well as the zoning bylaw working group, who's working on a rewrite to our zoning right now. He would like to address some comments. While we wait for Tom to get his microphone ready, I'll also just take a couple more of our written comments. We have Jean Haley Dippold. Thank you so much for the incredible presentations. Will the committee be posting their presentations along with the recording? I think the public would really benefit from seeing and studying these presentations. And the answer is yes, Jean, and everyone watching. We will make these presentations available under the Harbor Committee portion of the town website. So we'll work to get those up as soon as possible so that all this information can be publicly accessible on the website. And if anyone has any questions or issues navigating the website, you can reach out to me. My name is Lauren Lind, Planning Director, and my email is L as in Lauren, Lind, LIND @cohassetma.org. Tom, are you ready?
Yeah,
Thank you, Tom.
I really didn't expect to speak tonight, but and I'm Tom Callahan, 35 Hillside Drive. I'm just speaking for myself, but I'm a member of the planning board and the zoning bylaw working group. And the bylaw working group is looking to update and redo our current zoning bylaw. We have two provisions, Article 9, which deals with our floodplain and water protection district, and Article 14 that deals with our water resource district. And then we also have a zoning map that creates boundaries for those two districts. Right now, in any iteration of what we're discussing, there's no proposed changes to either of those articles. So I'm not authorized to hire a consultant or pay anybody money, but I'm asking for some volunteer help at this point to look at those two articles and our map of these two districts and see if we need any changes in light of climate resiliency. Ultimately, if we're going to deal with this issue, there are going to have to be changes on the ground. There was, just a question about the hotel project that was the result of a certain bylaw. We have other proposals in the harbor that are dealing with our existing bylaws. And just as a member of this committee and who's very involved in looking at the rewrite of the bylaw, I'd just like to enlist whatever help I can get to look at these two particular sections of our bylaw and suggest any changes that we should be making. So that's all I wanted to say. It didn't necessarily, I didn't want to do it like as a public speech here, but if anybody can help in that and wants to help look at that, your help would be welcome.
I would say that to the extent that you're dealing with floodplains and boundaries that are defined by our topography, I think Mark and Jack and I would greatly encourage you to use the latest digital elevation models for defining watershed boundaries and floodplains, et cetera. And so I can help you with that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that we may have to hire a professional consultant. I just personally, as one member of this committee, can't commit to that at the moment. I don't know, in so many areas of zoning, there are model bylaws that are put out there. I don't know if there's model bylaws that are dealing with climate resiliency yet, but if anybody knows of them, please forward those to me. But, I would love to get your help, Tom, and everybody's help. And if, we have to deal with this on a compensation basis, we'll deal with that. But right now, I'm just telling everybody, we're not looking at these two sections of the bylaw for any particular change, but I'm asking all of those of you who are involved in this issue and expert on this issue to suggest them to us. And I'm just opening the door for that. So.
Tom, if you could put your email in the chat, that'd be great.
Thank you very much, Tom. I also just wanted to note we had two hands up that I had joined us as panels, Jack Creighton first and then Steve Wenner.
Yeah, hi. First of all, again, I really have to echo that what Jack, Mark, and Tom have done is just superb, and thanks for Tim and Lauren and Lisa for making sure this happens. This is a problem that's not going away at all. I also serve with Tom on the bylaw rewriting, as well as the selectman's representative on the harbor. So we really have to work together on this because we are a coastal community. In my years on Concom and Stormwater, it was very, very, very clear that we really, Cohasset has a very fragile environment. We don't have a lot of resiliency. There's no place for the water to go. And one of the big issues that this really pointed out is you're getting it from both sides. The hillsides behind us, Bear Hill, and we should understand that's compacted glacial till. So there's very little water being absorbed. So that's coming down the same time the water's coming in. So, you know, one of the things I know Tim has really championed this is using the breakwater at Bassings Beach and rebuilding that, and perhaps that can form some kind of barrier. And I know there's always been barriers in, you know, in Europe and around here, down in New Bedford, to stop that storm surge. And it appears that we need to consider that. But again, I think it's very healthy that this community has come together and we have such good analysis, and we're kind of ahead of things. So congratulations to all of you, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that commentary, Jack. Mr. Steve Wenner, did you have a comment?
Yes, I'm Steve Wenner, I'm a resident of Cohasset. I'm speaking for myself, but also as a climate activist, a member of several climate organizations. Wow, what amazing presentations we had. The risk of flooding is worse than even I had thought from looking at the models. I consider myself a pessimist. I want to mention that from NOAA's data, as interpreted by Surging Seas and also the Union of Concerned Scientists, Massachusetts harbor is we can expect a higher sea level rise in most coastal areas of the United States. They're predicting 6 to 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And of course, it doesn't stop then. It just keeps on going up from there. Well, if we are able to meet the Paris Climate Accords, the models also predict that the rate of sea level rise will be cut about in half. So we can stretch out our time without this increased risk of flooding if we all work together as a world community and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So I hope that Cohasset will do its bit for the general welfare and work to implement the Global Warming Solutions Act, the new roadmap bill, and encourage our legislatures to implement policies which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that commentary. I will next, John Leffel, did you have a question? I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks again, folks. This is really informative, and I thank everybody for their involvement and their time. I guess as the first person listening to this, I'm wondering what's on the to-do list. We have very clearly identified the risks, the probabilities, and it's wonderful work that people have done. What can we do? Near term, short term, long term? I mean, what's the action plan? I mean, I don't know if there is an action plan, but I think we've decided pretty clearly there's a problem. Where are we on the solution side?
So
I'm willing to help.
I'm happy to hear that you're willing to help, John, because that's always wonderful. We're always looking for more volunteers. What I can tell you is that
I have your phone number, John.
We have got a series of recommendations in some of the planning documents that we have already that do give us some short, medium, and long-term priorities and goals that we can get to. But I think what we're realizing here, and as we dig more and chip away at some of these goals, they lead to more concrete answers and evidence that sort of just highlight why we're doing this to begin with. And I do think that ultimately out of this and the larger climate seminar that we're planning in this community, we hope to move towards some sort of, whether it's a climate action plan or something that gets us a more tangible result. Right now, I feel that we're in a continued data collection phase and public engagement, but we recognize that there's something that needs to be done, and we're working with the community to identify what that is, what that means, and what the timeline for that looks like. So John, again, I would love to have your contact information, because I'm sure we would need some more volunteer support as we move forward with these initiatives. So great to hear that you're involved.
Only if Tim helps me.
So Lauren, I might want to just address one of the issues on the sewer plant. I am aware, and I don't know if anybody from the sewer commission is here, but I am aware that the sewer commission has taken that very seriously about protecting our sewerage plant from, obviously nothing will protect us from catastrophic, but that has not been ignored. And I don't want to speak for them, but I think it's important for the town to know that that has not been ignored. The other thing, it's very clear from this presentation and other things that I've attended, that we have to have some manner of stopping the storm surge. And I think we're also learning that we need to have some way of seeing what's happening with this fresh water coming down from the watershed.
This is George. I just like to lay out, we knew we wouldn't have time to both figure out the problems and the solutions in a single day. So as part of the series that we're sponsoring, the next session, we do want to look at what is the state of municipal vulnerability planning, and hear from some of the parties involved that they didn't have the opportunity today, and they're not sitting on their hands. So we do expect to have that opportunity coming up in our next session. And then these are not exclusive. There's other stuff going on in parallel with all this. And then our third session is we're inviting the state's legislators to talk a little bit about funding. There are known funding sources. The town has been successfully seeking grants that are related to climate-related issues, but there's new initiatives, as we're all aware, at the federal level and others, to put money toward climate change. So we're going to try and get a real-time view of that, hopefully in a March timeframe, view from the legislator on what are funding opportunities to then go after some of the solutions that are identified as part of an action plan. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to read a couple more of the comments from the Q&A section. We have Susan Hoadley. Thank you for this important and informing session. We would like to ask if you've seen any predictive modeling relative to the VE15 and AE11 zone lines that occur at the southern edge of the harbor. I'm gonna throw that either to Mark or Tom.
So we're talking about V zones and A zones. So we're talking about the federal insurance, flood insurance rate maps. I haven't seen any predictive models. I would say that using flood insurance maps for anything other than flood insurance is tricky. They're built for one thing. They're put together at a certain scale. And when you try and use one data piece of information for another reason, you get very sketchy, right? It wasn't built to do a sort of parcel by parcel assessment. So when you start to get down to that level, you really want to get, you want to get engineers, and you want to get people doing site-specific surveys, things like that. Flood insurance maps are great, but they're only great for flood insurance, as far as I'm concerned.
I'd amplify that even more to say that they're not really at the kind of scale that we're capable of these days. The new digital elevation models give us unprecedented ability to look at very small parcels, in great detail. And the FEMA maps are very generalized. So they as Mark says, they're great for insurance, but this is not the sort of analytical data that you want to use to actually evaluate flood risk necessarily. And I believe they were built quite some time ago. This is, I don't remember the vintage of the ones we're using now. I was just looking at some from 1986. I think these have been updated in about 10 years ago, something like that. Mark, maybe you are better versed in that than I am. But
No, that's about right. Yep,
Yeah.
that's about right.
Thank you both for that information.
by the way, that these after Hurricane Sandy, the federal government spent a huge amount of money flying all of our coasts, literally all of our coasts, not just the East Coast, but Gulf Coast, West Coast, the whole works, with this amazing tool called LiDAR. And they even have added an additional one that can see about 30 or 40 feet into the water. And so now we don't just have LiDAR data, we have bathy LiDAR, which is bathymetric LiDAR, to give us the elevations of sea bottom quite a ways out, at least off Cohasset's coast. So we have these amazing data sets now that are just right at our fingers. Just need some computer power and a good internet connection to access them.
Yeah, I used to have an advisor who would tell me that looking at a flood insurance map to figure out how likely it is that your house is going to flood is like looking at your car insurance rate to figure out if somebody's going to steal your car tonight. You know, so it doesn't really work out.
Well, thank you all for those comments. We have a comment from Susan Bryant. I wish all participants on civic engagement events had seen this before we'd embarked on planning and prioritizing, and recommend that other towns do this before the rest of their MVP process if they're just beginning. Great job coordinating this very informative panel. You have Cassie Malatesta of 153 Sawyer Street saying, well done, a big thank you to everyone involved. And then a question for me from the Dick family: has the Cohasset Emergency Management Agency been engaged on resilience and contingency planning for wastewater treatment plant, public safety, and well fields? I can say briefly to summarize, yes, they have. When the town underwent their hazard mitigation plan update, there was a representative of Cohasset Emergency Management who sat there as part of the group that updated that plan and identified areas of concern. I do think that this information, though, is very important to circulate and keep this conversation going. I don't have any other further detail as to the ongoing discussions between Cohasset Emergency Management and the Sewer Commission, but I'd be happy to circulate this information so that all parties are up to speed on what we've discussed tonight. So that's all for our answer or questions in the Q&A section. I don't see any last hands up, so I'm going to give just a quick, if anyone else has any remaining comments, now would be the time to either let us know or raise your hand. And in the meantime, I just want to take an opportunity to say thank you so much to all of our attendees. There was a great attendance here tonight. Thank you all so much for your interest. Thank you, Mark Borelli, for coming out and joining us in Cohasset virtually to present this information, to the other speakers, Tom, Bell, Jack Buckley, and to George and Lisa for organizing this, and of course, Tim Davis for all your leadership with the Harbor Committee. And thank you to, we had numerous elected officials come out, many of our select board members. We have Jack Creighton here as the panelist who was speaking earlier, but we had several of the other members of the select board, among Cohasset Conservation Commission members, planning board. So I think we got a lot of great representation from our elected and appointed officials. So thank you all so much for your time. I'm not seeing any more comments or hand raised, so I'm going to turn it back to George for some closing remarks. Thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you, Lauren. I can only second it. Really great presentations. Really appreciate those of you in the public who raised your hand, who asked questions. Your engagement is also what this is all about. And we look forward to continuing this level of engagement and ideally this level of expertise that's brought before as we try and grapple with these weather and climate change related events. I do especially want to thank the speakers who spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to anticipate your questions and anticipate a flow of this conversation. A really great shout out to Mark, to Tom, to Lauren, to Jack. Thank you so much. And I guess on behalf of myself and Lisa Hewitt-Dick, who helped co-organize this effort, and for Tim Davis, thank you very much for attending tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.